Another point that stands out to me is when they teach there's the Old Testament and then there was a fulfillment that Jesus did something on these days. So Passover, for instance, was the sacrifice of a lamb. Jesus came as and gave us the bread and wine. Unleavened bread was a day of distress the next day, and then Jesus was crucified. And then Jesus resurrected on first fruits, is what they say. They have these particular teachings. They compare Leviticus chapter 23, and they say this is what was fulfilled. In again, going back to the Green Book in chapter 2, there's a section. It says the 7 feasts in 3 times, and it goes through. In the first line, it says, "In the law of Moses, there are 7 feasts grouped into 3 times a year. In Exodus, there are the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Harvest with the Feast of First Fruit, and the Wheat Harvest and the Feast of Ingathering. And in Deuteronomy, there's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles." Deuteronomy 16 to 17. And then the next paragraph, it says, in the middle of it, it says, "Even though they are called a feast in 3 times, they are not 3, but 7. So he makes this claim that the feasts are known as the feast in 3 times. I had a conversation with a rabbi. I was in touch with him to understand more about the feasts. And I did a Google search, and nobody calls it the feast in 3 times. He's like, even though they're called the feast in 3 times, they're not 3, but 7. Nobody calls it that. I just thought it was something that everyone knew, but I had no idea. But in reality, nobody calls it. What he's saying here is that there are 7 feasts, and then the Bible will cluster them into 3 different groupings. He says that if you go to the next page, the first grouping has Passover and unleavened bread.
I'm sorry, Anthony, which chapter or page are you on right now in the Green Book?
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2, okay.
Yeah.
And in your book, do you have the just the English version?
Just English.
Okay, what page are you on? Should be at the same
16.
page. Okay, I think I'm there.
Yeah, I was on 15 first, and now I'm on 16. On the very top, okay. It says, the first time, Passover and unleavened bread. The second time, first fruit and Pentecost. The third time, trumpets, atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So with this one, they say that the Feast of First Fruits is separated from the Passover and unleavened bread, that they're 2 different categories, right? So these 2 feasts lump up together, these other 2 feasts lump up together, and then these 3 feasts lump up together. There are 3 different times. But when you go to Leviticus chapter 23, and it's in the section from 4 to 8, so it speaks about the Passover and unleavened bread. So the first month, 14th day is the Passover. The next day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then on verse 8, so chapter 23, verse 8, it says, "For 7 days present a food offering to the Lord, and on the 7th day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work." So to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's the day after the Passover, you have a celebration. And then 7 days later, you have another celebration for unleavened bread. The Church of God does not do that. The Church of God just has unleavened bread celebrated the first day after Passover. The other one that the Bible teaches them that they should be keeping 7 days later, they don't keep at all. But instead, it says in verse 9, verse 9 down through 11, it talks about when you should keep the Feast of First Fruits. And verse 11, it says, "He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath," meaning on a Sunday. So they say the Feast of First Fruits is to happen the day after unleavened bread. They keep the first Sunday after unleavened bread is when they should be keeping Feast of First Fruits, which they call Resurrection Day now. So if this feast is kept the day after, the Sunday after the first day of unleavened bread, then that means that it will fall within the time frame of the 7 days of unleavened bread. Meaning, if they keep it the way that the Church of God keeps it, then the Feast of First Fruits will happen sometime in the range between the first day of unleavened bread and the 7th day of unleavened bread. So If you could, kind of figure that out on a calendar,
Mhm.
it's saying though, first fruits belongs to a whole different cluster of feasts. But if that's the case, then why is it dead in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread? So if An Sung Hong's teaching is correct, Feast of First Fruits, it's supposed to belong to a second grouping, but it falls in the middle of the first group. So how can you say that this Feast of First Fruits belongs to the second time when it falls in the middle of the first time? Or if they say, well, then maybe it's the first Sunday after the seventh day of unleavened bread, then that means Jesus resurrected a whole week early. If it fell on first fruits, he would have resurrected a week before he was supposed to. So they can't have it both ways. Mm-hmm. Either if first fruits is supposed to happen after the very first Sunday, on the very first Sunday after unleavened bread, the first day of it, then they're wrong about the clustering. If it happens after the seventh day of unleavened bread, then the whole thing gets thrown off, because now Jesus resurrected a week early. Then you throw off the whole count for the Feast of Weeks. Everything gets skewed from that point on. So, their teaching about the feast is wrong because they don't keep unleavened bread the way that the Bible teaches it.